Good morning and many thanks for allowing me to be part of your Sunday morning this morning. I'm standing on the edge of Mount Baldy, which is a mountain range just behind Los Angeles, looking out there to the Pacific Ocean. I want to read from Revelation again, chapter 7 and verse number 1, which says, "And after these things I saw 4 angels standing on the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, nor on the sea, nor on any tree." And we do look to God to bless his word this morning. That begins one of the periods of judgment that God pours out upon the world in the book of Revelation. You might remember that the judgments in the book of Revelation are awful in the extreme. If you can imagine all of the catastrophes of the last century of the world all rolled into a space of about 7 years, you've got a kind of a sense of the judgments that are being poured out upon the world. Those 4 riders of the apocalypse, some global war, the destruction of civilization, really as we know it, the pouring down from heaven of meteors, earthquakes, famines, fires and disasters. It's all in there in the book of Revelation. And yet at the beginning, something fairly benign seems to happen. Something almost unnoticeable, and maybe even something that you could interpret as a kind of a blessing from God. The wind ceases to blow. It doesn't seem to be too big an issue. In fact, maybe sometimes when the wind ceased to blow in the Bible, that was a bit of a blessing. You might remember in John's Gospel, chapter 6, the disciples are there on the storm-tossed boat. The wind is blowing, the waves are rising, and the storm is all around them. It's a terrifying experience. It would have been, I'm sure, for them something of a blessing if the wind ceased to blow. And yet that very simple statement at the beginning of Revelation chapter 7, it really covers one of the great catastrophes that God pours out upon the world. Because if the wind ceased to blow, not only would you have peace and calm for a little while, but you would also have a period of extremes, a time when the world would heat in the centre, and it would be colder at the polar caps. It would be a time where the weather systems would change, and instead of the wind bringing with it the dew and the clouds and the moisture, all of that would go. It would be a time of barrenness, a time of dryness, a time of silence, and a time of extremes. God's wind first begins to blow in the book of Genesis chapter 1, when the Spirit of God moves in the face of the water, and God blows, and he blows in creatorial power. It is one of the great catastrophes, not only for this world, but for us individually, when God's wind ceases to blow. When we cease to feel or to hear the experience of God, things go silent. Now that might seem to be a bit of a blessing. It might seem to be a bit of a blessing if God ceases to speak. Well, for once, you wouldn't really be troubled with your conscience anymore if God ceased to blow, if God ceased to speak. You might not be annoyed by the reality of one day having to face God because he's backed off from your life. And in Romans chapter number 1, you would find that some people persist in their sin, and God backs off and he gives them up to that sin. His wind ceases to blow, and it becomes a cold, barren experience for them. And yet, somehow, sometimes we get used with that. At the foot of these mountains, there's a place that I'm sure most of us have heard of. It's Hollywood. It's part of Los Angeles. We were on a short tour of one of the many parts of that town, a place where the films are made. It's a place that is built around the entertainment industry. It's there to fill a gap in people's mind, a gap in people's spirit. It's there to fill a silence. So many of us dislike silence. We dislike being left just to think and just to reflect. And there's a whole industry down there that churns out distraction after distraction after trivial distraction. And that happens too, of course, in the Bible. sometimes God ceases to speak. He ceases to blow, if you like. It happened with King Saul, a man who was meant to be leading the nation of Israel, and God ceased to speak to him. Somebody came in. It was someone with satanic influence, and they began to speak in the place of God. In the days of Elijah, there was a sense in which God also was silent for the most part. And then comes the false prophets of Baal. And in the days too of Samuel, there was no open vision. God was not speaking, but other things were taking God's place. It is perhaps one of the most difficult to recognise catastrophes on the individual life and in the life of the world as itself. If God ceases to take an interest, if God stops to take an interest in you and God stops to speak to you, catastrophe lies just around the corner. For Revelation chapter 7 begins that series of events that end in the utter destruction of the world. If we begin to cease to hear the voice of God, that is a real cause for concern. We must seek him with our whole heart, because when God begins to blow again and when God begins to speak, the end result of the movement of that Spirit of God is found in John chapter number 3. And there was a man called Nicodemus came to the Lord Jesus Christ by night. He was looking for the way to heaven, and the Lord Jesus Christ pointed him to the reality of a personal living experience of God by the Spirit. It's when the Spirit of God moves and blows in the human soul that real change happens. It's when the Spirit of God convicts of personal need, of personal sin, of the reality of who Jesus is. It's when the Spirit of God draws us in faith to the God that created these mountains and the rivers that are down there as well, and the snow. And when God created all of this, it's his Spirit that draws us to the God behind that, and it's his Spirit that is able to take us and change us and transform us, to convict us of sin and draw us in faith to his Son Jesus Christ, who is the means by which God is able to speak to us. I do trust that you know him. I do trust that you have come to enjoy him, and if you have, it's by the reality that God has blown by his Spirit on your soul. Thanks very much for being with us this morning. Thank you.